Take 2. '70's nutz. Here I am on my second take of this video because I accidentally hit Control-Z too many times, and then I tried to switch projects to get back to another project that didn't exist, and I hit no, please don't save changes to this other project that I was working on, and it deleted all of the footage that I recorded. So here I am, once again, recording this video right in front of this fridge that it's probably not from the 70s, but it's got fake wood, so, you know, close enough. The 1970s. We're going to be starting off with a piece of history that is more commonly attributed to the 1960s. However, actually the majority of the Apollo moon landings occurred during the 1970s. So from 1970 through 1973, we had the Apollo missions 13 through 17, which successfully landed 12 astronauts on the surface of the moon. These missions are more commonly glossed over in favor of Apollo 11, with the exception of Apollo 13, because that was the one that didn't land astronauts on the moon, and they made the whole movie about it, well, multiple movies. But I don't intend to skip over them today. No, we are going directly over the other missions and going to Apollo 17. Now, Apollo 17 was notable because it was the first time that a civilian, that means not a military test pilot, landed on the moon. This achievement was followed shortly thereafter, shortly preceded by Congress's announcement to stop funding the Apollo programs, which had originally planned to run out all the way through 20. But the 1970s was about a lot more than just the Apollo missions. There was a wide array of very, very famous unmanned probes that went up into space during the 1970s, the most notable of which probably being the Voyager probes, which are still kicking around today, though it remains to be seen if they will make it to their 50th anniversary. So one thing that is not commonly talked about that makes the Voyager probes notable is their ability to actually store data on board the spacecraft. This was a major improvement over the previous Pioneer missions, which had exactly 0 data storage. Now, the Voyager probes achieved this major accomplishment with the extremely lightweight, cutting-edge, and very information-dense 8-track. Back to the manned missions, well, following the Apollo programs, NASA was left with a bit of a conundrum as for how to continue. And so, following a proposal selection, they developed and refined the concept for the space shuttle throughout the 1970s, which ultimately culminated in the first launch, which was also manned, of the first space shuttle in 1981. This proposal phase, there was actually a time when the prospect of a nuclear space shuttle was considered, and so there were nuclear propulsion engines that were developed during this time. However, it was later abandoned during the 1980s because the engineering challenges were just too great for the time. In terms of nuclear energy and power generation, the 1970s saw unprecedented growth in the number of nuclear reactors across the world, with roughly 20 coming online each year. But this growth did not come without its own challenges. As we all know, there was the 3 Mile Island disaster in 1979, which temporarily slowed the growth of nuclear energy, but then it rebounded in the early 80s until 1986, when we had Chernobyl. Wait, this video is about the 1970s. Sorry. Also, in the world of energy, because of growing tensions between the Arabian countries that supplied most of the world's oil at the time, and the West, specifically the United States, the cost of oil globally went up significantly. And that led to a rise in cost of pretty much everything. Which, though it may seem like the rise in cost of oil may make nuclear a more appealing option, in reality this also increased the cost of actually constructing nuclear power plants. So in the end it was a net loss for everyone. The US presidents of the 1970s, namely Gerald Ford and Carter, were met with a unique problem, well, somewhat unique problem. The leading, or I suppose guiding philosophy for curbing inflation and dealing with unemployment at the time was that one could be traded for the other. So you could exchange inflation or higher inflation for a lower unemployment rate. And so the policies of the 1970s were based around this theory and aimed at reaching a sort of balance where we could lower unemployment by increasing inflation. However, the reality was much different, and the measures implemented resulted in both high inflation and high employment. Diving deeper into the US presidents of the 1970s, we first start out with Gerald Ford, who is probably one of the most boring presidents to ever be in office, with maybe the exception of some of the guys you've never heard of in the who had terms in the 1800s. Commonly known as the most athletic president in US history, Gerald Ford was also the first president to fall down the stairs of Air Force One, so great job remaining relevant to this day. Well, the only other notable thing about his presidency was the Whip Inflation Now program, also known as the WIN program, which aimed to encourage Americans to do more thrift shopping, I suppose, which more this. Which I guess makes my costume all the more 1970s. The Carter administration, though, was a lot more interesting. The presidency was generally considered a failure, and many of the issues that are blamed on the Reagan administration actually began with the Carter administration. To talk about music and popular media during the time of the 1970s. So, after their amazing hits of the 1960s, both Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel went their separate ways to have their own music careers. One of them may have outshone the other a little bit. The 1970s was the second decade of the domination of the 12-inch vinyl record, though this main form of musical media existed alongside, things like 8-tracks or reel-to-reels, or I don't know, I'm pretty sure cassette tapes were invented around that time. There were a lot of very famous movies that came out during the 1970s. The one that surprised me the most was Jaws, which I mostly think of in my mind as an 80s movie. However, it was released in, I don't know, here's the date on screen. Some other notable releases were the first Star Wars film, that's right, Star Wars A New Hope, released in 1978. There was also Apocalypse Now and The Godfather, as well as Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The year that's coming to mind is 1977, is that correct? Alongside your collectible Star Wars action figures, some popular products of the time were well, I guess I have to mention it. Pet rocks. Honestly, I think that pet rocks were an are an absolutely ingenious invention. They're very good at accomplishing what they or their intended purpose, which is to separate money from the consumer as economically as possible. I'm just kidding. They're good for if you don't, or if you want to get your kid a pet without getting them a pet. One of my favorite inventions from the 1970s has to be the Walkman, which allowed you to essentially have portable music. The popular cultural icons that the 1970s are best known for are probably, disco, as well as bell bottoms. And however, the hippie aesthetic was a sort of late 60s and early 70s phenomenon, which is interesting to see. The trends don't always are not actually, if we think about it, they're almost never actually defined by the decades. They just existed time periods that are roughly rounded to decades. I don't know. There's some message to be had about American culture and interpretation of trends over the years, but I'm rambling now. And as the final outro and closing to this video, and what I'm sort of obligated to do because of this outfit, I am going to be performing a disco dance to demonstrate the result of my extensive research on the culture of the 1970s. No, just kidding. Never in a million years. I don't even need it to reach the time requirement. I'm good. As we never got to talk about smoke detectors and how the advance of battery technology allowed for them to be wall mounted, but you guys don't want to hear about that. Oh wait, no, this video is just gonna be seen by Mr. Nordquist. You like smoke detectors, don't you? Yeah, that's what I thought. Never mind. Goodbye.